Welcome back to the linguistic section of Logic, Language and Information. In this lesson, we'll be looking at entailment and implicature, different notions of consequence which apply to claims in natural language. Remember, we've seen that linguistics is the study of language in all its aspects. In this lesson, we'll be looking at semantics, that's meaning, pragmatics, that's the way that language is used in different contexts, and discourse analysis, the way that meanings are linked in between sentences in longer discourses. Take a look at this little discourse where Jen and I are talking about our friend Leslie. Jen says, "That's Leslie now," and I reply, asking what she's doing. Jen tells me that Leslie didn't kick the cat, and I tell her that I'll slice the lemon. This is a perfectly normal everyday interaction, but if you don't know the context, it can be really difficult to know what it is that we're talking about. When you learn that Leslie's back from playing tennis, you can begin to piece things together. The dialogue involves lots of little inferences or little deductions. When Jen tells me that Leslie didn't kick the cat, I deduce the conclusion that Leslie won her tennis game. She only kicks the cat when she loses. And I infer from the fact that Leslie won the conclusion that she'll want a gin and tonic, and hence it's time for me to slice the lemon. These inference steps are not valid arguments. It's perfectly possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false in each case. But this isn't a bug. It's not a problem. It's a feature of our reasoning here. If we wanted to only infer using valid arguments, we'd never get our little discourse going. It's a feature of our reasoning in everyday situations that we make bigger jumps from premise to conclusion using steps that aren't valid and aren't exceptionless inferences. Let's look at different kinds of inference steps we might make. If I say that there's a cat on the mat, it follows that there's an animal on the mat. Now this isn't a valid argument by itself because there's no connection yet stated in the argument between the words cat and animal. But if I supply another premise that if something is a cat, it's an animal, that connects being a cat with being an animal, then the argument becomes valid. Similarly with this argument, if I painted the door red, then it follows in some sense that I painted the door a colour, and if I add the premise that red really is a colour, then the result is a valid argument. In general, we'll say that the premises of reasoning entail a conclusion if the argument from the premises to the conclusion would be valid if you added into it premises that are true in virtue of what the words mean. In this case, these arguments supply entailments, since the extra premises, that if something's a cat, it's an animal, that red's a colour, are the kinds of things that are true because of what the words cat, animal, red, and colour mean. Here are some more examples. Suppose Madison drives a Toyota Prius. It follows that Madison drives a car. That's an entailment because the claim that a Toyota Prius is a car, pretty well everyone agrees with that when they understand what the words mean. If Charlotte ate the cake but got better, it follows that Charlotte ate something. This is another entailment. But does it follow that Clancy didn't get any supper, given that her father didn't cook any supper for her? No. It might be reasonable for you to make that deduction, but it needn't follow. It's not an entailment, because she could have got supper from her mom, she could have cooked it herself, etc. So here are 3 more examples for you to try. Which of these 3 deductions are entailments and which aren't? How did you go? If you've got questions or comments, or if you'd like to explore these issues further, take a look at the course notes for this section and head into the discussion boards to follow things up. I'll take a look and see how you're going. Now, we're going to look at the kinds of steps in inference that aren't valid arguments and aren't entailments, and which happen again and again in discourse. These are implicatures. Paul Grice, a philosopher who was active in the middle of the 20th century, developed a theory of how implicatures work, a theory of what he called conversational implicatures. An implicature is something that we mean or imply or suggest by way of saying something else. And when you know some basic logic, you can get a good understanding of how implicature works, and we can see the different ways we can say what it is that we mean. So if somebody asks me if I have any children, and I reply that I have a son, then I'm implying or suggesting that this one son is the only child that I have. But that implication or suggestion isn't something that I've explicitly said. All I've said is that I have one son. Now that claim that I made, that I have a son, would have still been literally true had I had a daughter, or even if I'd had another son. I didn't literally say that I have one and only one child, but I suggested it, or I implied it, by offering my statement as an answer to the question about whether I had any children or not. So an implicature is a part of what a speaker means, but is not a part of what the speaker explicitly says. So if person A asks, "Can I trust him?" and person B answers, "Well, he's never been convicted of a crime," B means to communicate that he's not really trustworthy, or at least that he's not likely to be trustworthy. B's claim isn't a ringing endorsement of A. Now, if I receive a reference letter for somebody applying for a philosophy job, and the letter says, "Jones dresses well and writes grammatically correct English," then I will conclude that Jones is no good at philosophy. These implicatures differ from entailments in a number of ways. Entailments cannot be cancelled. If I say I have one daughter, then it follows as an entailment from that I have children. So I can't cancel the conclusion that I have children by saying I don't have any children after saying I have one daughter without sounding like I'm contradicting myself. Whereas the implicature can be cancelled. So if I say I have one daughter, that might seem to imply that I only have a daughter, if I use that as an answer to a question. But if I follow that up with, "and I have a son too," that cancels that implicature, that the daughter is the only child that I have. And that sounds like it makes sense. If you say, "How many kids do you have?" and I say, "I have one daughter," and then follow up with, "and I have a son too," I haven't contradicted myself. Entailments are the kinds of things which happen regardless of context. The claim, "I have a daughter," entails that I have children, and it would entail that in any kind of context where I speak. Whereas, whether or not I have one daughter implicates that I don't have any other children depends on what question I'm answering. If you asked, "Do I have any daughters?" and I said, "I have one daughter," then this doesn't implicate that I don't have any sons. Entailments can't be reinforced without sounding odd. If I say I have one daughter, that entails that I have a child. And if I say that explicitly after I say I have one daughter and I have one child, that sounds just weird. Whereas if in answer to the question, "Do you have any kids?" and I say I have one daughter, and I then add, "and that's my only child," that makes sense for me to say, even though it was implicated by what I already said. So entailments and implicatures are quite different. But how do they work? Well, Paul Grice gave an account of how these implicatures work. According to Grice, these implicatures follow naturally from the way that we treat a conversation as a genuinely cooperative exercise. His cooperative principle is that you're to make your conversational contribution, what you say in a conversation, the kind of thing that's required at the stage where it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. Now, this cooperative principle isn't prescriptive. It doesn't say you must do that. It isn't a rule you have to follow in every circumstance. No, of course, you can do what you like. You don't have to cooperate. But if you're playing the communication game, cooperating is a part of that game. You can decide not to cooperate with others if you like, but if you do want to engage in communication with others, the more you cooperate, the more productive it's going to be. Now, Grice unpacked this concept of cooperation into 4 rules, or 4 things he called maxims. The first is the maxim of quality. Make your contribution one that's true. They're quality contributions. Don't say what you believe to be false, and don't say what you don't have adequate evidence for. That's a quality maxim. And if we're trying to cooperate about the world that we're engaged in, then, of course, saying true things or things that you think to be true and not deceiving is a part of cooperation. Grice's second maxim is the maxim of quantity. Say what you need to, but no more. Make your contribution as informative as required for the current purposes of the exchange. And don't make your contribution more informative than is required. So if you ask me the time because I'm interested in when the tram comes, you might say it's about 2:30, or you might say it's 2:45 or something. But if you said, oh, it's sometime in the afternoon, that's not enough to be informative. And if you said it's 2 hours 34 minutes past the 2 hours and 53 seconds, that's way more information than we need for the purposes of the conversation. The third maxim, the maxim of relevance or relation, says to be relevant, contribute to what it is that you're talking about, and don't change the topic arbitrarily. Finally, the fourth maxim is the maxim of manner. That says be efficient in what you say, and that's a grab bag of things. Avoid obscurity of expression, which sounds a little bit obscure actually if you ask me. Speak clearly, don't be ambiguous, be brief. So if I wanted to defy this rule, I'd say avoid unnecessary prolixity, and be orderly. Say things in an appropriate sort of order. And these are Grice's 4 maxims. Now Grice shows how we can generate implicatures using these maxims. He shows that this can work in 2 ways. First, when we assume that others that we're talking with are following along with the maxims. So if somebody answers with the answer, her light is on, in relation to the question, is Jeanette home, then it's plausible to assume that she is home, or it's likely that she's home, because if you knew that her light was on all the time, irrespective of whether she's home or not, then you wouldn't offer this as an answer to that question, because it would no longer be relevant. So, to go back to the example we started off with, if I answer the question, do you have any children, with I have one son, it's very plausible for you to infer that this is the only child I have, because if I had more children, I would have also mentioned them in this answer, as well as the son that I did mention. To fail to do this is to violate the maxim of quantity. But we can also exploit violations of the maxims. If I ask a friend who's studying for a PhD thesis how her thesis is going, and she immediately changes the subject to talk about the weather, we can conclude that it's not going well, or at the very least she doesn't want to talk about it. And she feels strongly enough about this to violate the norms of conversation, to avoid talking about. That's a violation of the norm of relevance. Similarly, if an opera critic states that Miss Jones produced a series of sounds intended to correspond to the aria from Rigoletto, then it's fair to say that she sang badly. But notice this. This description would still be true of anyone who sang the aria, whether they sang well or badly. But it's a clear violation of the maxim of manner, since it's more complicated than it needs to be to explicitly say how well she sang. Which is so a natural conclusion to draw from this is that saying this is a way of avoiding having the critic say something explicitly bad about Miss Jones. Now, there are many more examples like this, and the notes and the online exercises will help you get a sense of how cooperation and the maxims generate conversational implicatures. That's the general theory of conversational implicatures. In the last lesson of our linguistics section, we'll use this account to shine a brighter light on the behaviour of the logical connectives themselves.